Hello, my lovely spooky folks. Welcome to my channel. My name is Chaos, and I am an indie horror author. Today, we are going to be talking more about folk horror. This is episode 2 of the deep dive into the subgenre of folk horror. To start things off, I want to explain what we'll be discussing in this video. It is a long list. This will hopefully be a longer video, so you can just put me on in the background and do whatever you want. So first, we will be discussing the folk horror chain, which is a set of recurring themes that show up in most folk horror entries. That is both film and literature. Then we will be discussing the texts that informed folk horror. That's The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, published in 1890. That's Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland, published in 1899. And The Witch Cult of Western Europe by Margaret Murray. And we'll be discussing those more in depth, with more information and how they informed the folk horror genre. Next, we'll be discussing the 3 movies which are the cornerstones of the folk horror genre, and that's The Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. This is not going to be a review video for those movies. We're just going to be discussing them and how they are similar, how they are different, and how they encompass folk horror as a subgenre of horror. Then we will discuss folk horror in literature, as that is my main focus. Literature is where I get the most joy from. It is where I get the most entertainment in the folk horror genre. We'll be discussing folklore and fairy tales, and we'll also be discussing modern folk horror. I'm currently reading 2 folk horror books. That is Cunning Folk by Adam Neville and The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. So I'm hoping to have both of those books done while filming this, so I'll be able to throw in thoughts and everything throughout when we get to that section, and kind of talk about that stuff, that, how those 2 books fit into the genre. And finally, I do want to discuss modern folk horror in film and where the genre is going in both film and literature. So that is what we'll be discussing in this video. Hopefully it will be a longer one. So yeah, let's get going. So, it is a new day, and we are going to talk about the folk horror chain and recurring themes that show up in most folk horror entries. The folk horror chain is a term coined by Adam Scoville, who is a writer and a filmmaker, to describe the unholy trinity of British films that are foundational to the folk horror genre. These films are Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. Scoville says the chain was created to account for connections between these movies, but to also allow a degree of flexibility in their differences. There are 4 links in the chain, and those links are, and this information is from Folklore Revival. I will leave a link down in the description. Landscape. Often rural, but people carry the lore and fears from rural locations to cities all the time when they move. So it could take place in a urban setting. Below the foundations of every town is earth with a more ancient past. So I really liked that quote that I read. And that kind of calls up that wherever a town is, there's always an ancient past somewhere deep in there. Everywhere you go has a genius loci, a spirit of place. Therefore, every place you go has the capacity for folklore and thus folk horror. Folk horror is related to psychogeography, a thought form put forward initially by the Situationist art movement regarding the hidden landscape of atmospheres, histories, actions, and characters which charge environments. and also going with landscape, there's nature's influence. The idea that the natural world can be both beautiful and terrifying, often playing an active role in the horror. So I'm going to do links 2 and 3 together because they kind of play off each other sometimes. Links 2 and 3, isolation and skewed belief system. These works are not necessarily rural, but typically feature a community cut off from society, a village, a small town, a moor, or island. Isolation is also highlighted by the appearance of outsiders who are themselves now isolated. And that comes from Paul Gorman, writer and book blogger, Revenant Journal. Skewed beliefs, as demonstrated by the pagans of Summer Isle or the happy villagers of Children of the Stones in 1977. This can connect folk horror with what is sometimes called backwoods horror, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of 1974 and Eden Lake of 2008. Folk horror and backwoods horror share the factor of a main character or characters finding themselves around people who do not think or act the way they do. Something you'll find in common amongst many folk horror films and books is the integration of paganism and witchcraft into the setting and or beliefs. Elements of old religions, pagan rituals, and witchcraft that contrast with contemporary beliefs and practices are common, especially in the older works, but also because folklore and folk customs are commonly a mixture of ancient pagan beliefs and more modern religious beliefs. And number 4, the fourth link in the chain, summoning or happening. Often the weakest of the links, it falls close to the conclusion of the film or book and may involve a supernatural element or be entirely earthly, such as an act of violence or ritual sacrifice. So those are the 4 links of the folk horror chain. And next we will be diving into the 3 foundational films, the Unholy Trinity, as they are called. So, yeah. Okay, so the Unholy Trinity, as it is referred to sometimes, is The Witchfinder General from 1968, directed by Michael Reeves. This film is set during the English Civil War and follows Matthew Hopkins, a witch hunter who exploits the chaos of the time to accuse, torture, and execute supposed witches. The film is noted for its brutal depiction of violence and its stark portrayal of the moral and social breakdown in a rural community. So that's number 1. Number 2 is The Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971, directed by Piers Haggard. This film is set in 17th century England and centers around a rural village where demonic influence takes hold after a farmer uncovers a strange demonic-looking skull. The villagers, particularly the youth, begin to engage in increasingly sinister and violent behavior driven by this dark force. And number 3, The Wicker Man from 1973, directed by Robin Hardy. This film follows a devout Christian policeman, Sergeant Howie, who travels to a remote Scottish island in search of a missing girl. He discovers that the island's inhabitants practice a form of paganism, and his investigation leads to a shocking and sacrificial climax. So, yeah. Those are the films we're going to be talking about, and I have a more detailed analysis of these. It's not super detailed, but it kind of talks about like the key themes and the impact that these movies had on the genre. So, Witchfinder General, we've already discussed the plot summary. The key themes of it are abuse of power, religious fanaticism, the breakdown of social order, and the brutality of mob mentality. The impact on folk horror. The film's realistic portrayal of violence and its historical setting ground the horror in a tangible reality, making it a cornerstone of the genre. And I want to say something that really stood out to me. I wrote a note about it, actually. The quote, foul ungodliness in womankind. That really stuck with me because it really goes with the blaming women and femme people for bringing the devil in, for sin. Um, Also, something that I noted was the Witchfinder is a total perv. Like, he wants all the young accused, all the female accused that are young to come to his room for a private confession. And it's just like, ew, gross. They're isolated, villages in the country. They're dotted far away from each other, An outsider is coming in. The Witchfinder is an outsider from these areas. He's coming in to investigate. So there's some there we got some of the folk horror chain right there, Oh, the witchcraft and the paganism. So, the next one we have is The Blood on Satan's Claw. We've already discussed the plot summary. Key themes: the corruption of innocence, the pervasive influence of evil, and the clash between the old pagan ways and the newer Christian beliefs. Something that I noted in this was, again, the use of womanhood, girlhood, femme characters, being the root of evil, of sin, of the demonic. The impact that it's had, the film's focus on a rural community and the insidious nature of the supernatural influence helped to solidify the aesthetic and thematic foundations of folk horror. And I do have to say, looking at it, this one came out in 1971. The Blood on Satan's Claw came out in 1971. And looking at it, it definitely had an impact on different films going forward, for settings and for the aesthetic. Again, it's isolated. It's an isolated farming community. An outsider comes in, and that's the judge. The judge comes in and investigates it. There's possession. There's a violent assault in it. There's the happening right there. The happening. So then we've got The Wicker Man from 1973. Key themes: the clash between paganism and Christianity, the role of sacrifice in religious rituals, and the power of community conformity. And the impact: known for its shocking and disturbing climax, The Wicker Man has become a cult classic and a defining film in the folk horror genre, illustrating the genre's potential for psychological and cultural horror. I think The Wicker Man really did solidify the pagan element of it, not so much just the witchcraft element, but the pagan element of folk horror. Again, it's isolated. An outsider comes in, the pagan customs, there's even more. There's folk music. There's the naked dancing that's very common in witchcraft and paganism, in certain groups. It seems like there's a fight between good, which the investigator deems as Christianity. He is good, and evil, which is the paganism. And there's that, and obviously the climax, the happening, the sacrifice. So I definitely see, like, these three movies, I see how they were determined to be the cornerstones, but as we'll see later, there are other media. There is other media that came before these movies that solidifies folk horror as a genre. Maybe not in film, but definitely in literature. So these three films are essential to understanding the roots and evolution of folk horror. They encapsulate the genre's fascination with the dark aspects of rural life, the resurgence of ancient beliefs, and the horrors that emerge when isolated communities follow their own twisted moral codes. And like, I think those definitely are key elements to all folk horror. And we'll look at modern folk horror later. So next, we are going to dive into the nonfiction that helped influence folk horror as a genre. And that's The Golden Bough, that's Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, and then The Witch Cult in Western Europe. So let's delve into the texts that have significantly informed the folk horror genre. The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland, and The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. These works provide a foundational understanding of mythological, cultural, and historical contexts that underpin many folk horror narratives. So first we're going to talk about The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, published in 1890. The Golden Bough is a comprehensive comparative study of mythology and religion. Frazer examines the similarities among various religious practices and beliefs across different cultures, focusing on themes such as magic, ritual, and myth. So the key themes and influence that this particular book has on folk horror are ritual, sacrifice, and magic. Frazer explores the concept of the sacred king and the idea of ritual sacrifice to ensure fertility and prosperity. These themes are evident in folk horror, where ancient rituals often involve human sacrifice to appease deities or natural forces, as seen in The Wicker Man. Mythological archetypes. The study delves into archetypal myths and their manifestations in various cultures. This influence is clear in folk horror's use of recurring motifs such as the harvest festival, the witch, and the ancient curse. And pagan practices. Frazer's work highlights the persistence of pagan practices beneath the surface of modern society, a theme central to folk horror's exploration of communities that cling to archaic rituals. And the impact on folk horror. Frazer's detailed analysis of ancient rituals and beliefs provides a rich source of material for folk horror narratives. His work underscores the tension between modern and ancient customs, a key element in films like The Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw. So, yeah. Next, we're going to be looking at Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland, published in 1899. Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, is a book by American folklorist Charles Leland. It claims to be a collection of Italian witchcraft traditions and spells supposedly revealed to Leland by a woman named Madalena, who he describes as a witch. So the key themes and influences that this particular book might have or did have on folk horror are witchcraft and paganism. Leland's work is one of the first to present witchcraft as a coherent, organized tradition rather than a series of isolated superstitions. This depiction has influenced the portrayal of witch covens and pagan practices in folk horror. The role of Aradia. The book centers on Aradia, a messianic figure who teaches oppressed peasants the secrets of witchcraft to resist their feudal overlords. This narrative has influenced folk horror's frequent themes of rebellion against oppressive authorities, often depicted through witchcraft and pagan rites. And folkloric authenticity. Although its authenticity is debated, Aradia provides a sense of folkloric authenticity that folk horror films seek to emulate, creating a believable and immersive world where ancient practices still hold power. And the impact on folk horror. Leland's depiction of witchcraft as a subversive and empowering force resonates in folk horror. Films like Witchfinder General and The Witch draw on the themes of persecution and resistance found in Aradia, exploring the darker aspects of folklore and superstition. And finally, we're going to talk about The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray, published in 1921. Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe is an anthropological study that argues for the existence of a widespread, organized pagan religion that was suppressed by the Christian Church and misrepresented as witchcraft. And the key themes and influence of this that could be in folk horror today are organized witch cults. Murray posited that witchcraft was a survival of pre-Christian pagan religions. This idea has heavily influenced folk horror's portrayal of witches as members of an ancient clandestine cult with its own rituals and beliefs. Historical persecution. Murray's work highlights the historical persecution of alleged witches, which is a recurring theme in folk horror. This can be seen in Witchfinder General, where the witch hunts are depicted as a brutal clash between old and new belief systems, and rituals and Sabbaths. Murray detailed the supposed rituals, festivals, and Sabbaths of these witch cults, providing a template for the elaborate and often sinister ceremonies depicted in folk horror films. The impact on folk horror. Murray's theories, despite being controversial and largely discredited in academic circles, have had a lasting impact on the popular imagination and the folk horror genre. The idea of an underground ancient religion surviving into modern times is a powerful narrative device in films like The Blood on Satan's Claw, where remnants of a pagan past resurface with terrifying consequences. And this is seen throughout history, the modern history. We can actually see that Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult of Western Europe really did influence Wicca. The Margaret Murray influenced Wicca, and Wicca did influence a lot of folk horror themes and everything. The concept of it surviving into modern times, the theory that it could be connected to ancient practices, although those things have been discredited by many people in academia. In conclusion, the themes and ideas presented in The Golden Bough, Aradia, and The Witch Cult in Western Europe have significantly shaped the folk horror genre. These texts provide a rich tapestry of myth, ritual, and historical context that filmmakers and writers draw upon to create stories that explore the intersection of past and present, the natural and the supernatural, and the individual versus the community. By grounding their horror in these deeply rooted cultural and historical elements, folk horror narratives achieve a sense of timeless dread and uncanny resonance. I'm sorry. Okay. Next, we're going to be talking about folklore and fairy tales. And I know I'm kind of making this go by fast, and I'm sorry, but I have it all written down. I did lots of research on this. So, okay. Folklore and fairy tales have significantly influenced the folk horror genre in both film and literature, providing a rich repository of themes, motifs, and narratives that evoke the primal and often dark aspects of human nature and rural life. These traditional stories are imbued with elements of the supernatural, moral lessons, and the uncanny, making them fertile ground for the development of folk horror. Here's an in-depth look at how folklore and fairy tales have shaped the genre. Folklore's influence on folk horror. We're going to start there. Many folk tales are set in rural, isolated villages or deep in the woods where communities are cut off from the outside world and adhere to their own customs and beliefs. Films like The Wicker Man and Midsummer use these settings to create a sense of isolation and otherness where ancient practices can thrive unnoticed by modern society. Folk tales often feature supernatural beings such as witches, spirits, fairies, monsters, and monsters, which represent the unknown and the fear of the wild. Movies like The Witch and The Blair Witch Project draw directly from these supernatural elements, using them to evoke fear and build tension. Folk tales frequently contain moral lessons or warnings, often highlighting the consequences of breaking societal rules or disrupting the natural order. Folk horror narrative. Folk tales frequently contain moral lessons or warnings, often highlighting the consequences of breaking societal rules or disrupting the natural order. Folk horror narratives often explore the consequences of transgressing social norms or ancient taboos, as seen in Blood on Satan's Claw, where the village's descent into chaos is linked to the uncovering of a demonic presence. Rituals and traditions, often with pagan origins, are a staple of many folk tales. These can range from seasonal celebrations to sacrificial rites. The rituals depicted in The Wicker Man and Midsummer are directly inspired by traditional folklore, emphasizing the power of communal practices and the sinister potential of blind adherence to tradition. Next, we're going to talk about fairy tales' influence on folk horror. Classic fairy tales, especially those collected by the Brothers Grimm, often contain dark and violent elements such as witchcraft, curses, and child endangerment. Folk horror literature and films often incorporate these grim aspects, presenting them in a more visceral and unsettling manner. Excuse me. For instance, the story of Hansel and Gretel has inspired numerous horror retellings that focus on the inherent darkness of the original tale. Fairy tales feature archetypal characters like the Wicked Witch, the Innocent Maiden, and the Malevolent Beast. These characters embody universal fears and desires. Folk horror frequently reinterprets these archetypes, adding layers of psychological complexity and horror. The witch in The Witch and the monstrous antagonist in Pan's Labyrinth are examples of how fairy tale characters can be adapted into the folk horror framework. Fairy tales often blend the familiar with the uncanny, creating a world that is recognizable yet disturbingly different. This blend generates a sense of unease and wonder. Folk horror films like Midsummer and Hereditary use this technique to create environments that are both familiar and deeply unsettling, drawing viewers into a world where the ordinary becomes terrifying. Transformation is a common theme in fairy tales, whether it's a character changing form or revealing their true nature. These stories explore identity, disguise, and metamorphosis. In folk horror, transformations often have a more sinister connotation. In The Company of Wolves, based on Angela Carter's reinterpretation of Red Riding Hood, the theme of transformation is used to explore deeper fears and desires, blurring the line between human and beast. And here are some specific examples and adaptations. Like previously stated, The Company of Wolves from 1984 is inspired by Angela Carter's retelling of Little Red Riding Hood in her collection, The Bloody Chamber. This film adapts Carter's story to explore themes of sexuality, transformation, the supernatural, using fairy tale framework to delve into darker, more adult themes. Pan's Labyrinth from 2006 is inspired by Spanish folklore and fairy tales, and Guillermo del Toro's film weaves fairy tale elements into a historical narrative set during the Spanish Civil War, blending the magical with the horrific to explore themes of innocence, brutality, and resistance. And finally, Gretel and Hansel, a 2022 film, is inspired by the Brothers Grimm fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. And this reimagining of the classic tale emphasizes the dark and eerie aspects of the story, focusing on themes of hunger, survival, and the corrupting influence of power. In conclusion, folklore and fairy tales provide a foundational influence on the folk horror genre, offering a wealth of themes, settings, and archetypes that creators adapt to explore contemporary fears and anxieties. By tapping into the primal and universal aspects of these traditional stories, folk horror can evoke a deep-seated sense of dread and fascination, connecting modern audiences to the ancient and the uncanny. So next we are going to be discussing modern folk horror, such as Adam Neville and T. Kingfisher, two specific books that I'm currently reading right now is what I'm going to discuss. And modern folk horror films, like we already discussed a little bit in what I was just talking about, and where the genre is going. So I will get that all ready and insert it here. So now we are going to discuss, in a way, two books. The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher and Cunning Folk by Adam Neville. I'm not done with either of the books, so yeah, I've spoiled them for myself. I don't really care. It's the journey getting there. It's not what happens at the end. Nothing is a spoiler for me. But The Twisted Ones follows the story of Melissa, a young woman who goes by the nickname of Mouse. She is tasked with cleaning out her deceased grandmother's house in rural North Carolina. As she sorts through the cluttered and unsettling home, she discovers her step-grandfather's journal, which recounts his terrifying experiences with strange otherworldly creatures in the nearby woods. Mouse initially dismisses his accounts as the ramblings of an old man, but soon she begins to encounter bizarre and horrifying phenomena herself. The creatures described in the journal and seen by Mouse are linked to a parallel world filled with twisted, nightmarish beings. These creatures are inspired by Welsh mythology and the works of Arthur Machen, specifically his novella, The White People. As Mouse delves deeper into the mystery, she finds herself drawn into a terrifying adventure that blurs the lines between reality and nightmare, folklore and reality. So, in The Twisted Ones, Foxy, who is a like an older mentor kind of character, calls these people the white people, holler people, because they live up on the hollers in this like other dimension that you can get to through going through a portal, in a sense. Basically, you're here, you walk through an area, and it's like just takes you straight to their area. Really, I want to say I've experienced something like that, but like I understand the concept of going from one place to another through that kind of, but it not truly being like a portal, but it being a portal to another world. I made some notes. I'm not quite done with the book yet, but I skimmed and I did some research and looking online and everything. So the rural setting and isolation. Folk horror often situates its narratives in isolated rural settings that are cut off from the modern world. There we go. Folk horror chain number one. The novel is set in a remote area of North Carolina where the dense woods and the isolation from the rest of the world contribute to the eerie and foreboding atmosphere. This setting is crucial in establishing the isolation that is a hallmark of folk horror. And it is absolutely necessary in this book that the characters are isolated as they are in this rural setting. Because it would be a lot harder to go off and lose yourself in the woods in a city setting than it is in a rural setting, and that's a big part of... You okay? That's a big part of this book, is losing yourself in the woods. The discovery of ancient texts and artifacts. Uncovering of ancient texts, artifacts, or folklore that reveal dark secrets or forgotten rituals is a common trope in folk horror. And it is. So, Mouse discovers her step-grandfather's journal, which serves as a gateway to uncovering the unsettling history and mythology of the area. This discovery propels the narrative and ties the present to the sinister past, a typical mechanism in folklore to reveal the underlying darkness. See, we're getting there. We're getting there. Supernatural and mythological influences. The folk horror element. Folk horror often incorporates elements of local mythology, folklore, and supernatural occurrences that challenge the character's perceptions of reality. The application in The Twisted Ones. The novel is heavily influenced by Welsh mythology and the works of Arthur Machen. I think that's how you pronounce it. Not 100% sure. Sorry if I'm messing it up. Incorporating eerie and supernatural elements. The creature's mouse encounters are drawn from these mythological sources, blending folklore with horror in a way that is central to the genre. Now, the thing is I haven't really been able to find a lot on actual folklore of holler people. But I do know that there are quite a lot of, I know I say it wrong, but I say Appalachian. But I know that there's a lot of Appalachian folklore out there that isn't shared widely with the world. So it's a possibility that there is actual mention of something similar to this in folklore somewhere. I don't know. I wasn't really able, I didn't really look deep into it though. But, you know, there is the possibility. The uncanny and the familiar folk horror element, I'm sorry. The genre frequently explores the uncanny, taking familiar settings or objects and imbuing them with an unsettling strangeness. And the application in The Twisted One, the novel takes familiar elements like a grandmother's house and the surrounding woods and transforms them into sites of horror. This twist on the familiar creates a dissonance that is unsettling and deeply rooted in folk horror traditions. And finally, psychological horror and paranoia, which is, like, it seems to be key in folk horror, is that paranoia, that fear. Characters often experience psychological distress, paranoia, and a gradual unraveling of their sanity. Mouse's journey is as much psychological as it is physical. Her growing fear and uncertainty about what is real versus what is imagined mirror the psychological torment experienced by characters in folk horror, emphasizing the genre's focus on internal as well as external horror. So, The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher is a contemporary novel that fits well within the folk horror literary genre. It incorporates key elements such as a rural and isolated setting, the discovery of dark folklore, supernatural influences, and a blend of the uncanny with the familiar. By drawing on traditional folklore mythology while crafting a modern horror story, Kingfisher effectively contributes to the genre, highlighting the enduring appeal of folk horror's themes and settings. So this was actually my introduction to the genre of folk horror in literary. I've read short stories, of course, but when it comes to novels, picking up this book was definitely a solid choice to enter the genre of folk horror. So, next we are going to talk about Cunning Folk by Adam Neville. It's a horror novel that follows Tom and Fiona, a young couple who, along with their daughter Grace, move into a rural house hoping for a fresh start. They quickly realize that their neighbors, the Moots, are not just eccentric but deeply sinister. The Moots are practitioners of ancient dark folk magic and use it to maintain control and power over the area. As Tom delves into the history and practices of cunning folk, traditional folk healers, and practitioners of magic, he discovers the depth of the Moot's malevolence. The story builds on the tension between modern life and ancient practices, exploring themes of isolation, the clash of old and new, and the supernatural influence that pervades the seemingly idyllic countryside. So, how does this book fit into folk horror, the genre? So we've got that rural setting and isolation again. and its application in Cunning Folk is the novel is set in a remote rural area where the isolation of Tom and Fiona's new home enhances the sense of vulnerability and exposure to the dark forces at play. This setting is instrumental to establishing the atmosphere of dread and foreboding typical of folk horror. Ancient practices in folklore. So again, we've got those ancient practices. We've got that, that folklore element. A hallmark of folk horror is the presence of ancient, often pagan practices and local folklore that clash with contemporary life. The application in Cunning Folk. The title itself refers to cunning folk, historical practitioners of folk magic. The moot's use of ancient rituals and magical practices against Tom and his family epitomize the clash between old malevolent traditions and the newcomer's modern sensibilities. One of the things I don't particularly like about folk horror is that it demonizes folk practitioners and practices, where these practices are not necessarily evil. It's coming, the evil aspect is definitely coming from a very Abrahamic world. And folk practices are not evil. Paganism is not evil. Witchcraft is not evil. Magic cannot be good or evil. It is the intent of the practitioner that drives the force which way. It's not the magic itself. It's not the energy around you that is evil or good, The supernatural and unseen forces. So we know that from everything else we've discussed. That's really common in folk horror and its application in Cunning Folk. The supernatural elements in the novel are deeply tied to the land and its history. The moot's dark magic and the malevolent forces they command are portrayed as intrinsic to the rural setting, reinforcing the genre's theme of the landscape itself being a character in the story. I understand that in these books and movies, it is an element and it is portrayed in such ways that it is scary. But I think we have to remember that these are actual things that people practice. A lot of the things that go on in these horror movies and these horror stories are actual practices. Community and outsiders. The folk horror element, the tension between an insular community and outsiders who challenge or disrupt the status quo is a common theme. We know that. Its application in Cunning Folk. Tom and his family are outsiders who inadvertently disturb the equilibrium maintained by the moots. This dynamic drives the plot and underscores the mistrust and hostility often present in folk horror when modernity encroaches on traditional ways. And here we go with the psychological horror and paranoia again. The application in Cunning Folk. As Tom becomes more aware of the dark forces arrayed against his family, his fear and paranoia intensify. This psychological horror is compounded by the supernatural elements, creating a tense and unsettling atmosphere that is characteristic in folk horror. Rituals and sacrifices. We know that these things happen quite often in folk horror. They are a necessity to the genre in most cases. The application in Cunning Folk. The moots, rituals, and sacrifices they demand are pivotal to the story. These elements are used to build suspense and highlight the brutal, archaic nature of the magic they practice, drawing on traditional folk horror motifs. In conclusion about Cunning Folk. Cunning Folk by Adam L.G. Neville is a contemporary entry into the folk horror genre that effectively utilizes its key elements. By setting the story in a rural, isolated area and focusing on ancient magical practices, Neville creates a narrative that explores the clash between modern life and old, malevolent traditions. The psychological tension, supernatural forces, and themes of community versus outsiders all contribute to the novel's alignment with folk horror. Neville's work underscores the genre's enduring appeal and its ability to evoke deep-seated fears through the intersection of past and present, the familiar and the uncanny. So, yeah. And like I said, I'm not done with these books yet. So these analyses, I'm almost done with the Twisted Ones, and I'm not even halfway done with Cunning Folk. So these analyses are based off of things I've read online from other people. So their thoughts and opinions may have come through in the information, as it commonly does. So I would like to go over 3 movies that encapsulate the folk horror genre and the elements that we've discussed that are more modern. Obviously, we're going to discuss Midsummer, we're going to discuss The Witch, and we're going to discuss The Ritual. And The Ritual is based off of a book by Adam Neville. So it seems that he is a very large influence on the folk horror genre when it comes to writing. I think a lot of his books fit into that category, that subgenre of horror. I'm just getting into his work. He's got a fairly decent catalog of work to get through. So let's discuss these movies. Midsummer, 2019, directed by Ari Aster. Midsummer follows Danny, a young woman traumatized by a recent family tragedy, who travels with her boyfriend Christian and his friends to a remote Swedish village for a midsummer festival that occurs once every 90 years. What begins as a picturesque and seemingly idyllic celebration quickly devolves into a series of increasingly disturbing and violent rituals. The villagers' adherence to ancient pagan traditions draw the outsiders into their ceremonies, revealing the darker, sacrificial aspects of their customs. My analysis of the movie is that it contains rural isolation. The film's setting in a remote Swedish village reinforces the folk horror theme of isolation, where the community is cut off from the outside world and its influence, pagan rituals. The villagers' adherence to ancient pagan rituals, including human sacrifice, that's a big one, is central to the narrative. These rituals highlight the clash between modern sensibilities and archaic traditions. Supernatural and psychological horror, see, it gets us everywhere. The blend of psychological horror and supernatural elements, particularly the hallucinogenic experiences induced by the villagers, deepens the sense of dread and disorientation. And finally, community versus outsider. The tension between the insular, homogeneous community and the foreign outsiders exemplifies the folk horror motif of the outsider disturbing the status quo and facing dire consequences. So next we have The Witch from 2015, directed by Robert Eggers. The Witch is set in the 1630s New England and centers on a Puritan family that is banished from their colony and settles on the edge of a remote forest. The family soon experiences strange and terrifying events that seem to be caused by a malevolent witch living in the woods. As paranoia and suspicion grow, the family members turn against each other, descending into madness and despair. My analysis is a historical and rural setting. The film's 17th century setting and the isolated homestead at the edge of a dark forest are quintessential folk horror elements, emphasizing the vulnerability and superstition of the time. The 17th century setting, remember, Witchfinder General and The Blood on Satan's Claw, both take place in the 17th century. So, you know, both those cornerstone movies have a historical setting. Witchcraft and superstition. The presence of a witch and the supernatural occurrences reflected the historical fear of witchcraft and the unknown, grounding the story in folklore and myth. Psychological dread. The psychological tension within the family, driven by fear, guilt, and suspicion, mirrors the internal and external horrors common in folk horror narratives. And nature as a malevolent force. This is the only one on this list, I believe. Let me make sure in my notes. Yeah. It's the only one on this list that has nature as a malevolent force. But remember, we talked about, like, way at the beginning, in the folk horror chain, talking about landscape, how nature can be used as not just the setting, but as a force of horror. So the forest serves as a mysterious and threatening presence, aligning with folk horror's theme of nature as a source of ancient, uncontrollable power. So, you get it when paganism and witchcraft are used heavily in a movie. You get nature as a malevolent force because nature is so intrinsic in witchcraft and paganism. But it's its own thing in The Witch. The forest is its own character almost. And there are other movies where they use the setting, like the nature, to be like a character almost. But this, I really liked that about The Witch. That's one of my favorite parts of the movie. I also like the animals, the use of animals in it. I think that's really cool. I mean, clearly goats, the devil, it goes together. And then finally we have The Ritual from 2017, directed by David Bruckner. The Ritual follows a group of college friends who reunite for a hiking trip in the Swedish wilderness to honor a fallen friend. When they decide to take a shortcut through a dense forest, they become lost and soon realize they are being stalked by a malevolent presence. They discover evidence of ancient pagan rituals and soon encounter a monstrous creature tied to Norse mythology. So, in this movie, we've got the rural isolation, the deep, uncharted forest setting creates a sense of isolation and entrapment characteristic of folk horror. Pagan mythology. The film draws heavily on Norse mythology this time, and ancient pagan rituals featuring an ancient deity and sacrifices that link the present to a dark mythical past. Supernatural and existential horror. The supernatural threat posed by the creature and the psychological impact on the characters emphasize both the physical and existential horror. And ritual and sacrifice. The discovery of ritualistic practices and the eventual sacrifice demanded by the creature are central to the plot, aligning with folk horror's focus on archaic traditions and their horrific implications. So, in conclusion, Midsommar, The Witch, and The Ritual all contribute to and perpetuate the traditions of folk horror by utilizing key elements of the genre. Rural and isolated settings, ancient and pagan rituals, supernatural elements, psychological tension, and community versus outsider dynamics. These films not only adhere to the traditional elements of folk horror, but also innovate within the genre, making them significant contemporary contributions that continue to explore the complex relationship between humanity, nature, and the supernatural. So, I'm going to go ahead and end it off here with a final little bit of a conclusion. Folk horror, with its rich tapestry of rural settings, ancient rituals, and supernatural elements, continues to captivate and terrify audiences by delving into the primal fears and superstitions that linger just beneath the surface of modern life. Midsommar, The Witch, and The Ritual are exemplary contemporary films that not only honor the traditions of the genre, but also bring fresh, innovative perspectives. By examining these films alongside seminal works and foundational texts in the genre, it is clear that folk horror remains a potent and evolving force in both literature and cinema. The genre's ability to tap into the universal anxieties and the uncanny aspects of the human experience ensures that it will continue to haunt and fascinate us for years to come. So I would like to thank everyone for joining me on this exploration of folk horror. And I will see you in the next one. Peace.